Welcome back to Conversations of the Leaky, Cauldron, episode 19, chapters 11 through 18. And back with me this time are my astute colleagues back from Northwest Con 42, fresh and energized, Miss Sarah Miller and Mr. Wesley Schantz. Welcome back, you two.
Hey, it's good to be back.
Greetings.
Greetings. It's good to have Ron, Hermione, and Harry back together today, or some amalgam of them, maybe Neville in there too. But in any case, y'all, I got to hear your recording at Northwest Con 42, and it sounded like it went really, really well.
Yeah, I thought so. I mean, there was more people there than I was expecting. I thought they were really energetic, and yeah, it was just a great experience overall.
Yeah, I think during the course of the afternoon, I was pretty anxious, to be perfectly honest. But who would be there and if anybody would be there. So it seems like, and I think maybe Wes and we talked about this afterwards. And maybe this was one of Steph's brilliant conclusions or observations that, not a lot of the panels allowed for conference goers to say chime in or give their opinion. And I think we made the right call in kind of building in some basically discourse time to illustrate our point and our project. And I thought that was pretty good.
And I thought it was just a fantastic illustration, not only that you gave kudos to where we first did our training in this method of discourse, St. John's, now many years behind us, both sadly and sweetly to say, but also that you actually engaged in the manner of discourse that we engage in. It's more like we're Socrates and not not Parmenides. That what you all tried to do is you shared your information, you shared your energy, and it did really sound like the crowd was energized. And Sarah, you even make the point near the end that you're like, wow, everybody seems pretty energized. They were asking good questions too. And, it seemed far more like what my idea of a conference or a symposium was before I actually started going to them in undergrad and graduate school and seeing usually a fairly dry scholar talk about an issue that didn't really have any direct relevance to me and that I didn't spark much creative thought in me, and then maybe trying to ask them a hard question, but not really getting much of a chance to participate. So it really did sound like a different thing and very much an ideal thing, and also its own good standalone conversation. So, y'all were incredible. You were incredible, and the crowd seemed very good too. What inspired y'all to conduct the seminar or the symposium or the conference in that way?
I think we had a lot of ideas that we kind of threw out there, and what we decided was that the best illustration of it would be to let the people there participate as much as possible. And so we sort of thought that if we had a small enough group, we'd do a more sort of formal actual seminar, try to carry on a conversation. But that with a lot of people, it would be important to just hear from them, what they were wondering and what they were noticing, and let them sort of have at it, and just kind of feel that delight that comes of looking, seriously at something that otherwise might have just kind of passed them by in the course of, the immersion in the story, and I think it forms a really nice, gentle introduction to that sort of entry point of questioning a text, and at the same time it gives you a sort of sense of the perennial nature of that. Like you can always kind of go back and start fresh and wonder about things that might seem obvious, but that the more you look at it, the more you find.
Yeah, I thought Wes said it in our discussion of what exactly we wanted to say. Wes, you said it really well, I think, about how, and I cherry-picked this in the conversation, but for those who are listening who didn't listen to our conversation, just the idea that there's ways to have an experience of wonder, almost especially with fantasy and sci-fi, and it's one of those four functions of the fantasy story that Tolkien writes about, that, to cultivate wonder is sometimes often done through just like pure immersion into a story, when you just can't put it down, you can't stop listening, you just want to keep turning the next page, just one more chapter. And that sometimes knowing the plot and knowing the characters so well, the stories lose their luster, right? They become this thing that maybe you like debate about on Reddit boards, but it's not something that you feel wonder at. And I think then the analytical piece, where you sort of break things down into their component parts and really dig and peel away layers and find connections and ask questions that are more intellectual about construction. And it reminds me like what I think about art, that like I can go into a museum and just be, totally immersed in these amazing paintings that are gorgeous, but that also when when you study a piece and break it down and figure out like what are some of the illusions that are being made in this piece, and what are some of the innovations that this artist is implementing, what are some of the ways that they are in conversation with other artists of the time or the artists who came before, it kind of recaptures a wonder that can sometimes be lost. And I thought that like giving people the chance to do the sort of like a modified version of what we try to do is a chance for them to see, like, maybe get a little portion of what I think the three of us are experiencing, which is that, man, I always really liked this, and I knew this method of inquiry was cool, but this is really fucking cool. That's I think that's,
yeah, it's answers like that I was listening to while listening to you two on that panel that made me really not just respect, but value, and not just value. Those aren't, those are lifeless words. I need something more vibrant. I had a real feeling while I listened to you up there. You both sounded like experts and people I would want to talk to. And then I had the joyous realization that I do get to talk to you all the time. And you really did sound, and I know that neither of you claims the title of expert, especially not in the same way that I constantly attempt to arrogate that title, but that both of you sort of presented yourselves as learners. But part of that attitude, and the fact that I think you're both very smart, and the fact that you both really know your stuff, really contributed to make you sound highly competent as well as highly engaging. It's like when that, I see a 53-minute podcast, I think, man, that's long. But while I was listening, it was short, and there wasn't even enough of it. I wished there had been more. And there was one other thing that Wes commented on, that just since we're reflecting right now, I'd be interested in sort of both of your perspectives on this, especially because, Sarah, you're so good at bringing in the Tolkien piece, and also have that breadth of knowledge throughout Narnia, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and Harry Potter, and have taught fantasy literature. But Wes, you made a comment about sort of the second part of our project being not only conducting ourselves in this manner of discourse and inquiry, but also considering contemporary mythology. I was wondering if you could say a little more about that.
Yeah, I'll try. Well, yeah, I think that's the piece we would have really liked you to be there for. The original
right.
For all of us to be there. And, you had to go and gallivant in the South Seas, and that's all good. But, maybe next year we'll do a longer one, and we'll really be able to do it properly with all of us there. Or at some other conference too. But yeah, the contemporary mythology thing. So there's a few different ways to kind of come at that. I mean, on the one hand, you have like a lot of different sort of popular fantasy, films, TV series, books, of course. And there's they sort of circulate, people gravitate towards them, or pick your metaphor, right? But there isn't really like one single overarching storyline really anymore that sort of captivates and unifies, I guess you'd say, the sort of like culture. And that's like in the nature of a democracy, I guess, is that people get to sort of pick what they like. But that it's really valuable to see the ways in which all of these different manifestations of myth and fantasy have a kind of underlying similarity to them. That the uniqueness of each one is in tension with its sort of similar structure or something like that. And to bring that out is really delightful, because you start to see these connections. You start to see like what is going on in the author's sort of activity that you might sort of miss as just sort of reading it for pleasure, and that doing so gives you a deeper and more interesting and subtle kind of pleasure, maybe, and maybe lets you see something about the structure of your own story or your own relationships with other people, and like how you construct meaning itself, right? Like that seems to me to be the great sort of goal in doing this stuff. Is like, yeah, on the one hand it's fun and enjoyable, and that's valuable, of course. Like it makes getting through what sometimes is pretty boring day-to-day work a little more bearable. But on the other hand, there's this thing where like you're actually learning something about the way the world works, I think, and like maybe seeing something new come out of all of these different video games and Game of Thrones, and like all this stuff, like how it kind of fits together and fits with much older and richer stories as well. So I mean, I think that's a really exciting element of it. I don't know that we have quite got a grasp on it fully, but that we're sort of pointing at it and saying, hey, like think about this, like do something with this.
Yeah, that's especially exciting given just at this specific time, there being the last of the Marvel Avengers movies coming out in game, as well as the final Game of Thrones episodes. Sarah, do you want to talk at all about that mythology element, or do you think we should jump into the text now?
I think for the sake of time, I think we should jump into the text.
For sure.
Yeah.
All right, so for this time we covered Hermione's Helping Hand, Silver and Opals, The Secret Riddle, Felix Felicis, or Felix Felicus, depending on your Latin, The Unbreakable Vow, A Very Frosty Christmas, A Sluggish Memory, and Birthday Surprises. Was there one of those chapters or themes across those chapters or events that really struck either of you, that you're really champing at the bit to dig into, to bite into?
Go ahead, Wes.
I was just looking at this stuff. I mean, what struck me this time was how dramatic, some of the kind of social problems are. We see, something that's been brewing a long time, this romantic attraction between Ron and Hermione finally kind of come out into the open. I thought that was really interesting, and it sort of works as a neat counterpoint to the ways in which love of the kind that we've seen with Harry, his love for his mother, her love for him, Dumbledore's love for him, right? Those are sort of played out as well, and also contrasted with the way that Dumbledore doesn't seem to fully embrace the young Tom Riddle, right? Like he can't trust him fully. He can't really open up to him, and that there's this weakness that comes with love also, right? So there's like this kind of fracturing of one kind of love, the friendship sort of thing that they have at as they are maturing, and as they're Ron and Hermione are gaining another kind of romantic love, as Harry is looking at Ginny in a different light, and struggling with that, and that hasn't fully come out in the open yet, but I mean it's probably starting to be noticeable to people, as much as Harry tries to control it or deal with it. So that was the thing, I guess, that I would be tempted to call the overarching like theme for these chapters that sort of links them.
Yeah, and my goodness, that was something I think Sarah brought up in our last regular episode, that relationships are more and more focused on and getting deeper and deeper and richer. And we even see more complicated things happening, right? Like before we see Ron and Hermione come out into the open, we see sort of subtle hints with Hermione, say, complimenting Harry in chapter 11, saying, "You're so fanciable now. That's why everybody's coming out. And you're so tall." And Ron almost bletching when he hears her say that, and then saying, I'm tall, and sort of trying to, and then, but also Hermione jinxing McLaggen, who's such a fetching catch himself, in sort of to help Ron, that it's almost like she's disgusted with him, that it's so obvious that she likes him despite his obvious failings, that and that he should just sort of get on with it. But then he goes the lavender route. Well, actually, I would like to ask you about that, Sarah. What do you think of how that goes down, that Ron and Hermione seem to be aiming towards something, and especially in light of book 4, when Ron had so much trouble with Hermione going to the ball, the Yuletide ball with Crumb, who was such an excellent choice, and with him sort of taking the least common denominator in lavender.
Well, I mean, it's hard not to just sort of revert to they're kids and they don't really have a well-formed prefrontal cortex. But I think there's something about Hermione and Ron's relationship that I think they don't love, or maybe even don't totally understand how they feel, like, compared to who they think the other person wants, right? I think like both of them in each other's eyes see themselves as like somehow not enough, right? And and as somebody who has, struggled with confidence issues all of her life, like it's a mark of, I think, childhood or adolescence and not adulthood, that you like who you are, and you have like an accurate understanding of who you are to someone else. And if people don't like it, they can, go fuck themselves, whatever. But I think, sorry, I'm having a Sailor Mouth kind of day, I guess. But
it's May.
So, yeah. So, for example, right, like Hermione is this extraordinary rules conscious person, right? She like is constantly, saying like, Harry, you could be expelled for doing that. She's confiscating Weasley things that are out in the common room. And yet for Ron, she broke a rule, right? She confounded Cormac McLaggen. And if I were Hermione, and sometimes I identify very strongly with her, that moment where I did something that runs contrary to the person that I present to the world, that person is a threat to who I am in this world. Like, her identity in this school, which is their world for the time being, her identity is built up in all of these moments where she has, been the person at the front of the class, raising their hand, following the rules, trying to get everybody else to follow the rules. And so when someone like Ron, when someone is in her orbit, and for that person, she sacrifices a piece of this personality that she embodies, because kids, and let's be real, even adults, like who we are and who we present ourselves to be, it's like a really important navigation that we try to figure out when we're in adolescence, right? You're putting on a lot of behaviors, you're trying on masks. And I guess if I were her, I would see, you get a little bit vulnerable and then you pull right back, right? And this person, Ron, and all of the things that she might be feeling about him, the confusion, are we friends? Are we more than friends? Was he mean to me? Why is he being nice to me? I don't understand, right? Like you're just seeing it only from one point of view, but you think you're seeing it from all of the points of view. And I guess I think for Ron it's similar, right? Like there are moments where he doesn't feel like he likes what he becomes. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but I guess I can understand why he picks somebody like Lavender, because she's easy, and because she confirms in him the version of himself that's like easiest to be, and doesn't involve challenge, right? Like I think, and just as much as Ron needs to become a better person, I think Hermione needs a little more flexibility. But like Lavender is an easier choice. She doesn't seem to have much happening upstairs. She seems to, all she wants to do is like wrap her body around him, you know, all the time. And it just, honestly, it seems totally free of like brainwaves. It makes sense to me that he picks her because he doesn't have to, like, he gets to put on a new mask, to be with her. Like he gets to be the big man on campus. I'm a free agent, you know, whatever. Like, I think that's sort of how I see it. Like that she's the low hanging fruit, shall we say. And it's easier to pick.
Yeah. What do you think about this Wani Poo, Wes?
Oh man, I love the way she writes these scenes. Like I think she has a real knack for this for whatever reason. I could just add that like the way that Ginny plays into it and the way that Slughorn plays into it, that's pretty interesting. Right? There's sort of like there's a push and a pull where like on the one hand, you know, Ron is jealous of Hermione because she's been picked up by the Slug Club, and he's like, you know, whatever, and she's like, well, I was about to invite you, but now I'm not going to. So they each are sort of prideful in that interesting way that must be, you know, what part of what attracts them to each other, and yet part of what makes them so sort of you know, fractious, but also, you know, Ron is put up to sort of finally making a move of some kind because Ginny really throws it in his face. You know, he isn't quite sure why, you know, seeing her making out with Dean in the hallway makes him so angry. She points out that it's probably because he has never kissed or been kissed, right? Anyone but their aunt, right? And so that must be pretty harrowing for him. And it's in front of his friend, you know, and Harry, of course, is feeling very complicated feelings at the time. And so that sort of pushes him in a direction as well. And I think that it also, you know, makes Ginny a more interesting and fully realized character because she sort of like stands up for herself. Like she dares him to call her a, you know, loose woman or whatever ruder term he might have found, and to not realize that most of what he's feeling is really jealousy, right? And so he does sort of abscond into this place where he can not have to worry about that too much and get certain sort of creature comforts. But pretty quickly, you know, he realizes that by itself isn't the thing either, right? It's not just the physical gratification that he's been missing. It's something more than that. And I think, on the other hand, Ginny is probably starting to feel that too, just as Harry is starting to feel that too. It's like, you know, you find out that with the with the love potions, right, as a form of like an extreme form of the simplistic, right, kind of falling in love idea, there's much more complex and interesting ones as well. And you can also, I think, go so far as to say that some element of that lack of love, of having been loved, of even wanting to experience it, is probably what makes Voldemort, you know, such a messed up kind of character. And I'll just come back to like wondering about Dumbledore's, you know, romantic love thing. Like he seems to be another kind of extreme.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's just like a very actually like complex portrayal of modern ideas about love grafted onto much older ideas about love, like how it can make you kind of crazy, which is maybe the oldest idea about love, right? It's all sort of just bubbling under the surface there. It's really, really interesting.
That I mean, you touched on it completely. I wanted to make this connection, and I think you make it even easier. I wasn't thinking specifically about Dumbledore, but I think we should, because we do get to go into the Pensieve with him again, and again noting that he's on again, off again there. I don't think we always have him here. Hermione says in chapter 11, showing again that there's sort of an inconsistency or an inconstancy to him, or that there's a hole that needs filling, that I think these students are going to have to fill. Dumbledore won't be around forever. But I really wanted to connect this to the secret Tom Riddle, the orphanage that we meet him at, and the incidents we hear that he's caused, and the magic that Dumbledore displays. And well, I guess I'll start with asking you, Sarah, what do you think about the interaction between Dumbledore and Riddle? What do you think about the fact that he shows this to Harry, and he shows this to Harry second after showing the home from which Riddle would have come, and maybe even in context of the third memory we see after the murders? But also, just what do you make of this initial interaction, and how does that relate to Harry's first interaction with Hagrid, or even with Dumbledore? And just what is it that we see there in relation? What is it about the solitariness or the absoluteness or the wanting to be different of Voldemort, of Tom Riddle, that does not jive with the theme of relationships and deepening relationships? And what is so deeply wrong about that? I think it's in that chapter that Dumbledore says that Tom Riddle at no time, or Lord Voldemort, has never had a friend. He's had many admirers and he likes trophies, but friends, no.
Yeah, the thing that I sort of wanted, this is a good opportunity to bring up the thing that I noticed as I was reading and listening, is the idea that Dumbledore points out at the very end of that chapter, where he points out to Harry, like, Harry notices, he can't really believe that Merope chose to die rather than to stay alive for her son, and Dumbledore says, "Is it possible that you have some sympathy for him?" And by the end of the story, I think Harry points out that, like, oh man, I did not believe that I was a wizard as easily as he did. He finds some fine distinctions between his story. I think the parallels are fairly obvious, right? Like dead parents, some random stranger coming in and telling you you're a wizard, blah, blah, blah. But I think Harry notices a few fine distinctions, and then Dumbledore points out, I hope that you notice, one, that he likes to do things alone. And that's when Dumbledore says, I don't think he's ever had a friend, and that there are some people who would say, that they are his closest confidant. But that what Dumbledore, I think, is saying beneath this claim that he's never really had a real friend is that there's never really been someone that he's been vulnerable and like equal in power sharing with. I think all of the romantic complexities of this reading, one of the things that Harry fears happening in his friend group is like, oh my gosh, what if they date him? Like, and by they, he means Hermione and Ron. What if they date and then they break up and then our friendships are forever changed? Or what if they date and they don't break up and then I'm on the outside forever, right? So these power dynamics that are a really important part of friendship and romantic relationship. He's like leaning into these emerging complexities, right? Like, how do I be both a friend and a captain? How do I be a friend to Hermione and a friend to Ron, and yet call them out when they're being shitty, right? These power dynamics, that's something that Voldemort has like never engaged in because he's never considered somebody like his equal, right? And then like the trophy piece is something that I noticed this week, because I think the reading for today also included like the necklace scene with Katie Bell and the meeting with where Dumbledore goes to the Gaunt, or not to Gaunt, to the Gaunt house, but where he goes to, Burke's, where he meets with the founder of Borgin and Burke's, and talks about where he got the ring. And it's just, what I noticed is that there's these really like ornate objects of like seeming beauty, but certainly like necklaces and rings and bracelets and trophies, these items that are of value. They are shiny, right? And that they're in each of these cases, they're used as a way to like manipulate or dominate or exert power over or buy or control another person, right? Like, so the trophies that little Riddle collected were evidence of his dominion over them, right? Or the necklace is a way for, you know, one person to exhibit a kind of dominance over the other. And what I thought it was a reflection of is that like the kind of commodification of relationship, like or the like when relationships become transactions, when someone gets something from someone else and the power dynamic is inherently out of balance, those are the kinds of relationships that Voldemort prefers. And he's just, I think, really exceptional at getting things from people, right? Like being transactional and not vulnerable, right? Like,
right. And
that's sort of what I got from this episode. I think that the other part that like really, I mean, honestly kind of freaked me out as I was listening / reading is how easily Tom Riddle as a boy can like fake something, right? Can like change his affect and his tone of voice to be pleasing to the adult in the room, particularly immediately after he was scolded. Like, I'm sorry, Professor. Like just sociopathic tendencies of being able to kind of turn that on and off. And I think you see that later with Slughorn, where he knows exactly what to say to transact with another person and to like extract something from them. And all of those kind of like seeing other people as like, you know, a space to be or some like a thing to be mined as opposed to another human being to be like to appreciate, is I think maybe for me a really key difference between him and Harry.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, Wes. And that Slughorn connection I just made myself, Sarah, that what do you think of the fact that this difference in power between Voldemort and this lack of vulnerability with him and his followers? And how does that affect what a friendship is, like Sarah was commenting on? And the fact that he's a legilimens, right? Like he will actually read your mind and take information forcefully from you, as well as use the unforgivable curses. And the fact that, yeah, like you said, Sarah, he does seem to have these like psychopathic, sociopathic tendencies to be able to change on a dime to do that which he needs to get what he wants, as well as how does that reflect Slughorn? And there was one other piece of the question I really wanted to ask too. Yes, why is it so important that these most important or these biggest lessons that Dumbledore is teaching are not so much about teaching spells or magic, but the difference between Harry and Voldemort? And what do you think that is?
Yeah, that is something I was curious about too, is sort of what Dumbledore's up to by showing Harry these memories in this way. Like on the one hand, he seems to be establishing a closer relationship with Harry, right? He singles him out for this kind of special treatment. On the other hand, you know, he is sort of placing Harry on an equal footing with him, or even sort of like trying to indicate the ways in which Harry is going to have to act on his own sort of knowledge base, and maybe showing him how to do some thought with the evidence that's presented, right? And I think, you know, it's in some ways just highlights the contrast with Dumbledore's relationship to Tom Riddle, right? He isn't able to become close with this lonely orphan who is clearly in need of like guidance, right? Because again, yeah, Tom seems to not desire that the way that Harry really does, like from the beginning, desire close friendships and parental sort of figures. He finds them in the Weasleys in some ways. He finds them in Sirius, of course, and now most of all probably with Dumbledore. Albeit, the ways that Harry is sort of struggling with his friendships, I think, is another interesting sort of inversion of the ways that Voldemort just avoids that entire problem, right? Like, he just has followers. He never has to sort of negotiate those kinds of bonds with people. And it's really, once we sort of learn more about the horcruxes, it's really interesting to think of those as sort of what Voldemort has in place of, giving his heart to other people. He sort of fragments it and thinks that he's, securing himself by that way. And so, like, the way that Harry is sort of like divided in his loyalties to some degree, right? Amongst his different friends and different responsibilities. That's like the opposite of what Voldemort is doing in some ways of hiding pieces of himself away in all of these, trophies. But I think it's really well done how the Horcrux is like introduced subtly through all these little trinkets and magical items and just items of like value to people. How I love how Dumbledore, the magic that he is demanded to show, right, by the young boy, turns out to be the magic that reveals how much more powerful Dumbledore is, right? That he seems to light the wardrobe on fire and the fire doesn't consume it, and all that it does is reveal like this thing that Tom thought was secret, right? And he has to give them back and not do that again, right? He's like brought to heel maybe for the first time, and instead of like latching onto that person and trying to learn from him, he immediately sort of shuts him off. Like you said, like, he shows him a face of docility, but then goes off to just do his shopping on his own, right? He doesn't want anyone's help. He just wants to sort of take the powers that he can in any fashion that he can. I think the contrasts with Harry are complex, and I think that they become pretty interesting as we learn more about those Horcruxes, which are so sort of tantalizing, right? Like, many times Harry's on the point of asking or trying to find out, and Dumbledore says, time's up. It'll have to wait.
Yeah, Sarah, I'm very interested to hear, what do you think about the idea that Voldemort's sort of ultimate power, the thing that makes him so different from others, is an artifact called a Horcrux, which we will soon learn actually derives its power from splintering his soul. It's a schismatic thing, and also is in fact a splintering act. You actually kill somebody in order to do that, as a sort of an act of power over relationship, or sort of like the Adlerian power drive defeating sort of the Freudian Eros drive, and how that sort of relates to the difference between the choices of Harry and Voldemort, and potentially even their nature. It's almost as if Voldemort wants to ever simplify the relationship between him and everyone else, and that's why he acquires more and more power, that it's going to be one of subjugation whenever he's around, to his mind, to his power, to his will. Whereas more Dumbledore's method is to open one's mind to possibilities and to the outcomes of differing possibilities. That's perhaps what he's showing to Harry, and what Harry has already started to deduce for himself, and sort of honoring the difficulty and the complexity of relationships. And like you were saying about vulnerability, letting himself be vulnerable and subject to emotion, as he so often was in that last book, often negative emotion. Negative emotion of public opinion, that Riddle seems to have decided, since he was hurt, he will hurt, and he will never be hurt again. and he will ensure that that is the case. Whereas Harry has been hurt, but he seems to sort of empathize or sympathize or empathize with other people about the fact that since he's been hurt, other people have been hurt, and that sort of connects him with them, and at the same time leaves him vulnerable while giving him strength.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, absolutely. I think there's something that is, we haven't yet gotten to the actual definition of the horcrux and the revelation of the true nature of that memory. I'm sure that will be in our next reading. But yeah, the whole, I think it is a fairly clear distinction that Harry looks at, think about him as a captain, right? He tries to bring people to work together as opposed to, like what we see of like Draco and his mother going to Snape and Bellatrix Lestrange saying like, oh, not everybody can know about this. Like he wants to keep, Voldemort keeps his followers in the dark, right? Like a terrorist cell where each little cell doesn't know what the other cell is doing, right?
Precisely.
And that's honestly that has a practical value, right? If one cell gets grabbed up, they can't rat on the rest of them. But Harry does seem to be about, at least in this particular book, like trying to figure out a way where he can like merge people or like synthesize or bring people together, right? And in like the last chapter one of the last chapters, just one detail that I noticed is that they were all seated together at the same table, right? The same thing is true like in potions, right? I think Harry has these impulses of trying to stand out or like keeping things to himself, right? But even like these lessons with Dumbledore, I thought it was funny that he asked Dumbledore for the permission to tell what they were talking about to Hermione and Ron, because I think even if Dumbledore said no, he would probably do it. But like that idea that like you need partners in this, you don't need followers, and Harry's resistance to like having followers, I think, is a real distinction. And the idea of like bringing people together versus severing or separating, I think is a pretty clear distinction between the two of them. I think in that scene with Dumbledore when he's a little kid, there's this line where he says like he assumes that his father was the one who was magical, because if his mother was a wizard, she wouldn't have died. And to me, that right there was like the first moment where I felt a little bit of sympathy for this like creepy child. And I think the movie depicts the creepy child thing pretty well, which is why I'm like having that in the back of my mind. But, for a kid who is extremely traumatized by that, and then by growing up in this space, and also having these kind of like yucky tendencies, I don't know. I sort of thought like, it makes sense to me why he goes so far out of his way to avoid or run away from or try and master death by dealing it to so many people around him, or using it as a threat, like why death is the worst. Because like in his mind it is. The other thing that I thought was interesting is, you guys probably know way more about this than I do, like this debate over, I don't even know if it is a debate anymore, but this idea of like, is Tom Riddle just a really bad kid, like by nature, or was he made like a bad person by his surroundings, right? By the trauma that he experienced, by the complete lack of care and in his like early upbringing, blah, blah, blah. But like, I think about what Harry must have experienced at the Dursleys, and like,
right.
I mean, Mr. and Mrs. Dursley and Dudley weren't like I guess you could call them abusive, right? Like, certainly neglectful and unfair, right? But like, is that the same as the orphanage, or was Tom Riddle as a kid just like shittier than Harry as a kid? I don't know. Like, that's something that I thought of as I was reading, but I'm not really sure if I addressed your question or if I strayed from the point. But I think your question was about like drawing people together. Maybe one of the things that exposing Harry to Voldemort's youth, and like this scene at the orphanage, maybe one of the things is to get Harry to see like how much of himself is formed by his experience with where he grew up, and are there any ways that can be leveraged as a weapon in the service of good, as opposed to seen as an excuse for being bad, right? Like, oh, I've been traumatized, I've never been loved, that makes it okay for me to be a horrible person, right? Can he find ways from his like suffering, which is real, to like, can he see good in it? Can he see some redemptive or some redemptive value, some resurrection in like, yeah, you had a shitty childhood. Is there a way you can turn that into, a strength as opposed to an excuse?
Yeah, I'm very much wondering what your answer to that question is, Wes, especially in light of the conversation we recently had about Zelda. We came across a very similar question, Sarah, about whether one is responsible for one's actions after enduring certain experiences. And I actually use the example of Harry Potter as opposed to Tom Riddle. So Wes, I'm very interested in that. And I also wonder whether you thought that the fact that Harry even asks Dumbledore whether he can share this information with others was itself indication that Dumbledore was right about Harry being different, because rather than wanting to stand apart from them, he wants to share everything he's learned. And that itself is a very different instinct from Tom Riddle's desire to be alone, to be separated, to be himself, like a schism embodied.
Yeah. I mean, just little things like that do seem to suggest a different kind of nature that each of these characters has. There's indications, I think, that Harry has inherited, certain, we're told, like, prejudices, right? Of course, he always assumes the worst of Snape based on a long history predating himself, right, between his father and with Sirius and Snape. And that's one of the points where Dumbledore tirelessly has to kind of correct Harry, right? Professor Snape, Harry, right? And that happens, too often for it to be a coincidence. And he becomes, rather severe with Harry when he sort of won't let go of this suspicion, won't trust that Dumbledore has understood, and maybe understood more than Harry did, right, from that scene that he saw between Draco and Snape, right? So there is still this kind of, conflict between Harry and Dumbledore. They don't have a perfect agreement or understanding between the both of them. But what's different does seem to be, Harry's desire for connection and for sharing and understanding. So that something like speaking parcel tongue, right, as Dumbledore points out, like that in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think this is sort of, to your point, Sarah, like, even if you do inherit a certain kind of nature in some sense, or even if you are in some way otherwise determined by like early circumstances or overwhelming circumstances of abject difficulty and struggle, right? It doesn't only have to play out in one way. That there is always, I guess, a certain amount of choice that enters in, and maybe luck even that enters in, like the thing, whatever you can't account for. And that's very much, it seems to be very much like belief in destiny, actually, right? The way that when Ron thinks he's drunk the Felix Felicis, he acts as if he has incredible luck. And the way that, even Scrimgeour says, like, it doesn't really matter whether Harry is the chosen one. It matters whether people believe he's the chosen one, right? I don't think that that's wrong, actually. Obviously, from Harry's point of view, it matters a lot, but that's just another way of saying that he truly believes that he is the chosen one, right? And so I just think there's a lot of give and take when you start getting down to sort of like questions of determinism and free will, and whether nature or nurture is more important, or whatever it might be, right? It does seem like this story ultimately wants us to think about the ways that there's always a chance, right? There's always the possibility that what we sort of most deeply desire, like, matters and has an effect. I think we've even shown a small amount of sympathy for Draco here too, right? Like, he's one of the most interesting mysteries that isn't like fully revealed also here. Like, as much as horcruxes, kind of get our attention, like Draco, I've felt this way throughout the whole story. Like, he's such an interesting little problem in that he seems to be determined. And yet we see here, like, he has very understandable motivations of, wanting to make a name for himself, sort of stand out and do this on his own, like prove himself. So yeah, I think that that's another sort of component to this as well.
Yeah, I think that idea that there's always choice, but that like that example of Ron and the Felix Felicis, and how well he performs thinking he's had some magic potion with his pumpkin juice or whatever. I wonder if there's like, is there a freedom when we think certain things are out of our control, like this ironic or paradoxical reality? Like, are we free if we surrender some of that to, say, luck or providence or destiny or the gods or whatever it is that that is the prevailing force that we ascribe certain events to, chance or something? Like, is there something, because he does so well, right? Like, is there something about a belief that there are things that are out of your control that, like, is liberating? And that if
Right.
that is the case, is there something about that choice that always exists, no matter what circumstance you have, like, as your quote unquote nature, right? There's something about, like, the choice that is just figuring it out, maybe too burdensome in certain places or in certain times or in certain circumstances. I wonder about that. Like, that choice is so hard, or it's tough to navigate, or there's something about it that's really hard to navigate when you don't have a mentor like Dumbledore, or when you don't have a community of friends, for whatever reason, maybe because you're a sociopath, or maybe because you don't want them. But I don't know. What do you guys think? Is that crazy? Or am I, like, way off base? I don't know.
No, I don't.
No, I think that was good. Yeah, go on, Wes.
No, I'm thinking about, again, thinking about Draco here, where Snape is, giving him every opportunity to open up and get some support and help, right? And it's that very thing, like, to your point, Sarah, like, that very suggestion that Snape wants to help is what causes Draco to sort of back away and mistrust him. It's like he feels that he needs to do this on his own, because that's, part of his great struggle in this whole thing. But that's so, like, diametrically opposed to Dumbledore and Harry's relationship, where Harry would want sort of more from Dumbledore, and maybe it's because Dumbledore isn't overbearing with what he's offering in terms of help. The idea that maybe a greater destiny is a freeing thing, or a a love potion or a luck potion is a freeing thing. I mean, I think even the power of a Dark Lord could be a freeing thing, right? Like, oh, I had no option, right? That seems to maybe account for some of the attraction for even his very early followers, right? And I think the ways that Slughorn tries to like cover up his own sort of being taken in by Tom Riddle are really interesting here too. It's like he recognizes that he made a mistake, and he seems to think that it's too late to do anything about that mistake other than like cover it up and pretend that it didn't happen, right? Avoid responsibility in that sense, like for what's past is past kind of thing. That's yet another way in which you can sort of jettison responsibility, because of course you can't undo something, right? Except maybe there is a way, right? In this ongoing kind of confrontation that seems to always be taking place in stories anyway, right? There does seem to always be a chance for redemption here, as annoying as that might be to Slughorn at this point.
That's so interesting, because it's as if there are two ways of then meeting your fate. There's sort of that liberating way of accepting it that Sarah was sort of mentioning, that when you accept that you don't dictate the circumstances but can just move within them, that perhaps that's sort of the state of egolessness. You're not controlling, you're flowing, that the Eastern religions talk about, where you sort of just let yourself be a part of the things at work, sort of like a Japanese painting with like a giant mountain and a tiny little man called the artist on the side, just a part of things, which also reminds me of sort of like those good moments when you're in a game and you're just in the zone, right? It's like you're one with the game. This has, in fact, been studied recently by sports scientists. And just your idea about belief dictating reality, like self-fulfilling prophecies, Wes, it's interesting. William James, a 19th century pragmatist, he wrote an interesting little piece on what is pragmatism. And he talks about if there were two armies fighting against each other, the one that believed they had a divinity on their side, if it were fighting against another one, ceteris paribus, that didn't, that it would almost certainly win. And just that it's as if the Death Eaters try and obviate, or not obviate, but do away with their responsibility by following a Dark Lord, in the same way that somebody might have said, I was just following orders, like the Stanley Milgram experiments, or, the popular example of the everyday Nazis. And they think or delude themselves into thinking that frees them from responsibility. It's a false freedom. It's truly a slavery. Whereas the true freedom that sort of Sarah was bringing up is recognizing that, opposite from the Death Eaters, you cannot control fate, and just by trying to alter the fate of others, but that you can just rise up to your fate. And so you sort of admit that you're going to die, that you're vulnerable, but you're going to do the best you can, rather than doing all the worst things possible in order to sort of, maintain yourself against others. Again, in that naturally schismatic way, no matter what, to even separate yourself from your own autonomy of the will.
Yeah, just real quick, one thing that makes me think of that I think is, maybe we talked about a little bit last time. They have to do spells without saying them now. I don't know why what you said made me think of that exactly, but something about sort of the recession of like self-assertion back into a stillness or something like that seems to be at play there. Like that seems to be such a major challenge for most things, except maybe not for everything, right? Like there's that exception where Harry masters the Levi Corpus spell right away. For whatever reason, he just sort of maybe in that sort of good that good sweet spot of not worrying too much about it and just kind of just messing around, right? So just one small sort of example.
Right. And well, speaking of being in the zone and things just flowing, time has flown without even noticing. Some strange relativity has taken hold of us in this crazy seminar space. And well, y'all, just to be a little more mundungously minded, perhaps. Well, no, I'm not trying to steal from you. What do y'all think about 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24 for next time? That would leave us a solid 5 and is a pretty healthy chunk of reading when I look at the page numbers rather than just the chapter numbers.
Yeah, that's a good chunk. I will try. That'll bring us through horcruxes, right?
Right.
Okay. I think that's the
Did you say 19 through 24 or 19 through 23?
It could be just through 23, just I suppose because of that's 90 what, 3 pages right there, 92 pages, 97 pages. Not 100 pages.
Yeah.
It's 93. Yeah.
I think I just want to be attentive to like how much is going to be in the chapters.
Sure.
That like if we're going to have quite a bit to talk about. I even think there are things that we didn't even quite get to in the reading for today,
right.
But
like the unbreakable vow.
Yeah, and like what the hell's going on with I'm just interested. I think that whole chapter on Christmas was interesting, and
yes.
Yeah, I think maybe going 19 to 23 will allow us to, especially if we feel like we want to catch up, but also that's sort of a nice break because that's right after the Horcruxes chapter, I think.
Yeah.
Sounds like we have a quorum. We have an accord. All right, y'all.
Okay.
Well, just before we sign off, I suppose I'm going to ask a standard question, a question that maybe we'll return to from time to time. But it is May, and it is May Day, and we are all teachers. And I imagine we're all getting pretty tired and looking forward to this summer. What would y'all be drinking tonight? I'll just go out and say I'd have a yogi kava tea. Kava is something they brew down in Fiji where I was, and I got to do a kava ceremony, and that was cool. But I've liked kava since St. John's. My friend Chris Moore turned me on to it, and I'd have that, and it would be very relaxing. It's a very relaxing drink.
Dang, that sounds good. I don't know, maybe just like a little gin and tonic. I always feel like that's a nice summertime, looking ahead to summertime kind of drink.
Well, it's Cinco de Mayo on Sunday, so
Woo!
Yeah, exactly. So I'll engage in a little typical American cultural appropriation of something that we don't even really know the meaning of this day to Mexican history, but I think a really good, not too sweet margarita is what tastes like summer to me. But also like a ton of old white ladies, a good white wine spritzer to me tastes like summer. But can you say that again, Alex? What is cava?
Kava
Do you mean
is
like Prosecco?
Kava is a sort of, there is a kava that, but it's a sort of tea that Yogi Tea puts out that uses a certain root from South America that is like valerian root, but is more, it's like chamomile. It's calming, and sometimes you have interesting dreams based on it. It has sort of a cinnamony taste. It comes in a purple, like a yellow and purple Yogi box if you use Yogi Tea. Look out for that Yogi sponsorship soon. But I highly recommend trying it. That said, I definitely want to get a margarita too.
Wes and I went straight for alcoholic adult beverages.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, well, y'all are smart, and but I'll definitely have that Cadillac. And I'll have maybe I'll raise 2 for missing it the first time. So I have to make it up to that on Saturday. So, which is, I think, the best time to celebrate Cinco de Mayo, even though it's a day before Mexican Independence Day. But that's the extent of what I know about it, besides the fact that I enjoy it every year.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
All right, y'all. Well, I'm looking forward to this next episode. And again, it was a real pleasure to get to listen to y'all. And I'm sorry I wasn't at that conference, but hopefully we can do another one soon. Maybe we'll start getting invited to those things eventually because people just like seeing us so much, at least like seeing y'all so much so far.
Maybe we will wear costumes next time, Wes, right?
Yes. We'll get our act together one of these days.
That's fair. At least the professor's black cloaks. I mean, why not wear one of those whenever possible?
Right, totally.
Sounds good.
All right, take care, y'all.
Take care.
Night.
Have a good night.